Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. And with Boris Johnson pushing what he calls the Canada-style deal or the Canada Plus Plus deal for the arrangement between the UK and the EU, Michel Barnier has said that such a deal would be impossible due to our relative proximity. So in this video, I'd like to lay out some of the objections to the Canada-style deal from the EU's point of view, including this proximity thing, but also how I think the EU may have made a bit of an error in ruling it out so quickly. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So when it comes to reasons why a Canada-style deal is off the table, I'd already discussed two fairly clear-cut reasons. The first of which is no matter how Boris Johnson bills it to the British public, the actual Canada deal between Canada and the EU involved agreeing some common rules. Of course it does. When you have any measure of free trade, you have to have agreed common rules. That meant Canada agreeing to some EU rules that it wouldn't have ordinarily adopted itself. But Boris Johnson has ruled this out. As a result, he himself has ruled out the Canada-style deal, nothing to do with the EU. The second thing is that the Canada-style deal, well, the actual Canada deal, involves tariffs and quotas on a small minority of the commodities traded, but nonetheless. And that means you have to discuss every single commodity that either side wishes to negotiate. And that takes years because you have to go through each individual one. But another reason is emerging from Michel Barnier and his staff, and that is proximity. So that means that if the UK would agree the same terms that Canada did and accepted that the deal would take years to negotiate, it would still be a no-go for the EU. And one of the reasons they gave was the interconnectedness of the EU and the UK. Very close together, can transport goods between each other, in theory, very quickly. All countries trade much, much more with their closest neighbours. Of course, it stands to reason. Not only are they culturally more similar and therefore much more likely to be interested in each other's products, and of course going to buy much more of those products, but the speed and cost of transporting those goods is way lower. And that's why it's a particularly low level of dumb that hurts my back trying to reach down to in order to suggest that, you know, if we can't trade as much with the EU, oh, no, that's fine, we'll just trade with others. Who? I mean, not only is there so much of the world's spending power located in the EU that it can't just be replicated elsewhere anyway, because where's the money? But we already sell as much to the world as the world wants to buy. And the cost of transporting it is not going to get any cheaper because we're no longer in the EU. The EU didn't make the cost of our transporting those exports more expensive. And in actual fact, trade's going to get more expensive with those other countries anyway, because at the end of this year, we're not just losing our trade agreement with the EU, we're losing it with like most of the rest of the world as well. And the sheer amount of trade that exists between the UK and the EU is much greater than that exists between the Canada and the EU. And actually, the amount of trade between the Canada and the EU is about to get lower because out of all the EU countries that bought Canadian exports, we bought the most. So, you know, in other words, the same deal for us that Canada have would give too large a competitive edge to the UK compared to Canada, and of course would not be in the EU's interest. And surprise, surprise, the EU are going to negotiate for what is in their interest. Used to be our interest because we were a member, not anymore. We chose to be their opponent. So perhaps, you know, if we'd like to install some outboard motors onto East Anglia and move ourselves to the other side of the Atlantic, perhaps we could get that sort of trade deal. But then we would still have to accept some EU rules, some common court of arbitration, whatever it happened to be, and spend a decade or so negotiating and implement it before it came into force. It's worth noting that the so-called Canada deal anyway is not fully implemented right now anyway. It's still going on years later. And another bone of contention is that for all Johnson's speeches of late denying that we'll cooperate with the EU on anything, we've signed an international treaty promising to do just that. We promise to accept a level playing field for free trade, to accept the European Court of Justice as final arbiter, to agree cooperation on security matters. Boris Johnson signed it himself, made great show of signing it himself. It should also be borne in mind that the UK government has still not published its negotiating position. Remember that over the last couple of decades since the Brexit movement has really started, although not with that name until recently, not a single Leave supporter has ever published their vision for a post-Brexit Britain, because they don't all agree on what it should look like. Not one single Brexiteer has ever said what Brexit will look like, other than shiny. Besides, negotiations are always more efficient when both sides are working towards the same goal. This is hampered in two ways. The first is that the EU do not trust Boris Johnson. I mean, I do not blame them. It's no wonder when he signs international agreements with them and then publicly says that he's going to break all the commitments in the agreement he's only just signed a few weeks ago. Sir Ivan Rogers, who's one of the few people in Britain to have ever negotiated international trade agreements, said some time ago that our negotiations will be much more complicated than normal, not simpler, and that's because we're trying to diverge. International agreements are all about converging systems, so you can sort of see where you're headed to. You may not know exactly where that point is, but you can sort of see the rough direction. When you're diverging, it's anywhere, could be anywhere. There's no clear end position. But as to the EU's statement about no Canada-style deal, there are numerous reasons for saying that it can't be done. But I have to say, I think, personally, they've made a diplomatic error in saying so publicly. Because what happens now, Boris Johnson gets to say the EU are being difficult. If I were them, I'd have been all for it. Oh yeah, great, that's the model you want? Fantastic, we can absolutely do that. After all, it does mean agreeing to some common rules. You know, so they just keep making a play of that. Oh, you want the Canada deal? That's brilliant. Yeah, Canada agreed to these sort of EU rules. You're agreeing to that too? Great, fantastic, that'll save time. See how that plays in the British media. It also means negotiating every single commodity that each side wishes to trade. And that's a lot of them. Go along with it. Oh, yeah, great. We'll come along to the first meeting with the first 1,000 things to discuss. Remember, the transition period ends this year, but negotiating tariffs and quotas takes years. Of course, the UK may just agree to the EU's position. The EU can have a position on all its commodities and could go to the UK, right, are you going to agree to all these then? No, we need to read it. Oh, yeah, it's fine. You take your time. And then again, the emphasis is on the UK. And then if it has any disagreements with it, hang on, we don't agree with this. No problem at all. We can talk about it. We're fine. The EU are not pressed for time. The UK government is pressed for time. Play with that. I'd have completely gone along with it because there's no way that Britain, the British public, are going to want to continue much into 2021 after the transition period ends with the absolute chaos that is going to ensue. Now, yes, that's not going to be great for the EU, but that's going to happen anyway. Stop Boris Johnson making it so easy to blame the EU for it. Long before a Canada-style deal could possibly be agreed, the British public will be demanding a far quicker and more comprehensive deal, which would inevitably mean completely free trade. That's the only way to get any sort of deal in a reasonable amount of time. And that, of course, means agreeing to all EU rules. Yes, when it all goes wrong in 2021, Boris Johnson has already laid the ground to be blaming the EU. And perhaps enough people will buy it, that it's the EU being mean. But they will still want to know what Boris Johnson is going to do about it. People who voted for him voted for different reasons, but I doubt anyone did it so that he could say that he was too weak and feeble to prevent chaos in our economy and our lives. So if the EU had gone along with this charade, they'd be stopping Johnson from blaming the EU for not giving his deal, because they are giving him his deal. It puts the blame right back on him. They could say that the deal, well, it could be concluded much more quickly if you agreed to full free trade and not selective free trade. We're okay with that if you want to agree to all our rules. Similarly, they could say, well, you were the ones who decided to leave the transition period. You could have stayed in the transition period until we concluded negotiations. And again, that would mean him breaking his promise to leave the transition period. It would be putting it right back on Boris Johnson. So yeah, I have to say, it is my view. I think they've made an error in the way they've approached this. Because they know they're not going to get a deal at the end of this. Boris Johnson doesn't want one. They know that. If I know that, they know that. And so really, 2020 is all about politics. And I think they've played the game of politics poorly in this regard. But that's my view. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.